Hey guys, tonight we begin with a frontier morning before the stove is warm, before the water is liquid, and before anyone has had the luxury of deciding whether they feel like getting out of bed. For many women on 19th century American farms, homesteads, wagon routes, and military posts, cold weather did not cancel domestic work. It made every ordinary task more complicated. Breakfast still had to appear. Water still had to be carried. Clothes still had to be washed, dried, mended, and sometimes ironed. Animals needed attention. Children needed feeding. And a fire that had faded overnight could turn the first hour of the day into a small engineering problem involving ash, kindling, damp wood, stiff fingers, and very little patience. The surprising part is that housework often extended far beyond the house. Women gardened, preserved food, tended poultry and cows, made soap, hauled water, helped with harvests, earned money, and on some frontiers washed clothing professionally for soldiers. So if you enjoy these quiet dives into the uncomfortable machinery of everyday history, like the video, subscribe for more, and comment with the frontier chore you think would have defeated you first. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Start with the fire, because almost everything else waits for it. A modern kitchen can produce heat with a switch. A frontier household could not assume that. Depending on place, date, wealth, and access to manufactured goods, a woman might be working with an open hearth, a fireplace fitted with cooking equipment, or a cast iron wood stove. The stove was a major improvement, but it did not make fuel appear by magic. Wood had to be cut, split, carried, kept reasonably dry, and fed into the fire. Ash accumulated. Draft had to be managed. If useful coals survived from the night before, the morning began with an advantage. If they had died, the process started farther back. And cold changed the stakes. The fire was not merely for comfort, it was the power source for breakfast, hot water, washing, drying damp things, heating irons, and a great deal of food preparation. A weak fire could slow the entire household. That is the first thing worth stripping away from the romantic picture of frontier life. Domestic labor was not a collection of separate chores. It was a chain of dependencies. Fire needed fuel. Cooking needed fire. Cleaning needed water. Laundry needed a lot of water, plus heat, soap, tubs, physical force, drying conditions, and more time than anyone looking at a clean shirt would probably guess. Water was especially unforgiving. Without indoor plumbing, it had to come from somewhere outside the room where it would be used. A well, spring, pump, creek, river, cistern, or another available source. The Carroll family homestead in Maine, preserved and interpreted by the National Park Service, offers a useful 19th century example. Water had to be carried from the well, while food ingredients were stored in different parts of the house. Even preparing a meal meant repeated movement between water, pantry, cellar, kitchen, and fire. On a freezing morning, that movement was not an aesthetic inconvenience. Buckets were heavy. Paths could be unpleasant or dangerous. Water exposed to severe cold could freeze, and every gallon brought indoors represented human effort before it ever became coffee, porridge, dishwater, wash water, or part of a recipe. Then came breakfast. What people ate varied enormously by region, season, ethnicity, income, household, and what had survived storage. There was no single frontier menu, but the basic logic was brutally consistent. Food had to be produced, purchased, preserved, stored, and cooked with what was available. Farm women commonly managed kitchen gardens, poultry, dairy work, baking, preserving, and other parts of the household food supply. In winter, the garden itself was mostly a memory, so preservation mattered. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, dried foods, smoked or salted meat, preserved fruit, flour, cornmeal, beans, and whatever a particular household had put away could become the difference between variety and repetition. The labour had started months earlier. A jar opened in January represented work done in summer. A sack of dried beans represented planting, harvesting, shelling, and storage. Butter represented an animal that had to be fed and milked, followed by processing. Bread represented flour, fuel, mixing, rising when conditions allowed it, and baking. Even the supposedly simple foods arrived at the table carrying a hidden history of labour. And women did not necessarily perform only the jobs later generations labelled feminine. On overland trails, National Park Service accounts note that women remained responsible for cooking and laundry while also gathering buffalo chips for fuel, driving ox teams, caring for the sick, and sometimes doing other work demanded by the journey. On homesteads, women could help with animals, harvesting, and field labour when circumstances required it. More than 100,000 women eventually obtained homestead land in their own names under the Homestead Act, while countless married women and daughters work claims officially recorded under someone else's name. That distinction matters. The paperwork can make a frontier household look like one man's project. The work did not. Now imagine that breakfast is finished and the laundry is waiting. This is where the morning becomes almost offensively physical. At frontier military posts, laundresses give us unusually detailed evidence because the army actually recognised their work. At places such as Fort Scott and Fort Laramie, laundresses washed for enlisted soldiers and received payment, rations, fuel, housing, or other benefits depending on period and post regulations. The job could mean handling clothing for roughly 15 to 20 soldiers, before considering a woman's own household or extra paying customers. Laundry was not a matter of filling a machine and leaving the room. Water had to be obtained in quantity. At Fort Laramie, laundresses drew it from a pump or the Laramie River. Washing could involve multiple tubs, hot or boiling water, a scrubbing stage, and rinsing. Soap might be homemade from lye derived from wood ashes and fat. Clothing was rubbed, scrubbed, wrung, rinsed, perhaps treated with bluing or starch, and hung to dry. After that came ironing, which required irons that were themselves heated by the household's fire. The tools tell the story. Tubs, washboards, benches, kettles, soap, water, irons, fire. None is particularly dramatic by itself. Put them together, and they form a system for converting hours of muscular work into something that disappears the moment it succeeds. Clean clothing. And in winter, success could still end with frozen fabric. Wet cloth hung in sufficiently cold air stiffens as its water freezes. Drying indoors could introduce another problem, because a small dwelling already had cooking, bodies, smoke, damp garments, and limited space competing for the same warm air. A family could not simply declare laundry day suspended until April. Clothing and linen still became dirty. Babies did not respect weather. Work clothes did not remain clean because the riverbank was miserable. This is why a freezing frontier morning is best understood not as a heroic battle against snow, but as a fight against friction. Every task had extra steps. Every resource had to be moved. Heat had to be manufactured. Water had to be fetched. Food had to be transformed. Cleanliness had to be physically produced. And once those jobs were underway, the day had barely started. If the fire gave the household its first pulse of the morning, water determined how far that pulse could travel. On a bitter winter day, water was everywhere in theory and inconveniently unavailable in practice. Snow-covered roofs, fields, paths, and fence rails, ice-sealed ponds and creeks, frost glittered across the landscape. Yet none of that meant a woman had a bucket of usable water beside the stove. Someone still had to get it. A well close to the house could make life easier, but close was a relative term when the ground was frozen, the wind was cutting through wool, and 2 full buckets had to be carried without spilling half their contents onto a path that might already be slick. Some households depended on springs, others relied on creeks, rivers, pumps, or stored rainwater. On isolated farms and new claims, the source could be less convenient than anyone would have preferred. And a household consumed water continuously. There was drinking water, cooking water, water for coffee or tea when those were available, water for dishes, water for washing faces and hands, water for scrubbing floors, water for animals, water for laundry, water for making soap or preparing certain foods. The bucket emptied with astonishing speed. That made water carrying one of those repetitive chores that rarely appears in dramatic frontier stories because nothing decisive seems to happen. No battle is won, no trail is crossed, no land claim is filed. A bucket simply becomes empty. Then someone fills it again. In winter, even the container could become part of the problem. Wooden buckets, metal pails, barrels, troughs, pumps, and exposed pipes or fittings all responded differently to cold. Ice had to be broken. Pumps could become difficult. Water spilled around a source could freeze into a dangerous surface. A woman carrying a heavy load had to negotiate the same path repeatedly, often while performing several other tasks at the same time. Once the water reached the kitchen, it was still cold. If hot water was needed, another stage began. Water went into a kettle, boiler, or pot, and the fire had to supply enough heat to raise its temperature. For a small amount, that might be manageable. For laundry, the scale became much larger. This is one reason wash day deserves its terrible reputation. Laundry was not necessarily performed every morning, but when it was done, it could dominate the day. In some households, preparations began before the actual washing. Clothes might be sorted or soaked. Soap had to be available. Enough fuel had to be prepared. Large quantities of water had to be collected. Then the heating started. A heavy kettle filled with water was not something casually lifted with one hand. Laundry equipment had weight before a single wet garment was added. Once cloth absorbed water, everything became heavier. The mechanics of cleaning were simple and exhausting. Warm or hot water helped loosen grease and dirt. Soap helped break the bond between grime and fabric, but neither replaced physical force. Clothing could be rubbed by hand, worked against a washboard, stirred, lifted, pressed, scrubbed, rinsed and wrung. Again and again. Hands spent long periods in water. Even when the water began warm, it did not remain pleasantly warm forever. Soap made skin dry and irritated. Homemade lye soap could be harsh. Knuckles met boards, cloth, metal edges, and cold air. A modern washer performs agitation mechanically. The frontier laundress was the agitation. At military posts, the scale could become almost industrial. Army laundresses occupied a strange but important position in 19th-century military communities. They were not simply soldiers' wives washing a few extra shirts. They could be officially attached to companies, receive rations and quarters, and earn money by laundering for enlisted men. That meant piles of shirts, drawers, socks, bedding, and other washable items arriving dirty and leaving clean enough to be used again. There was no electric motor hiding behind the wall. The process depended on muscle. Consider what happens when a wet wool garment is lifted from a tub. Water has filled the spaces between its fibres. It drips onto the floor. It is substantially heavier than when dry. Now imagine handling item after item while bending over a tub, straightening, rubbing, twisting, lifting, carrying, and bending again. The work punished the back, shoulders, wrists, and hands. Then came rinsing. Soap left in cloth could irritate skin and attract dirt, so garments needed clean water. That meant the water requirement continued after the washing itself. Dirty water had to go somewhere. Fresh water had to replace it. And then the clothes had to dry. On a mild summer afternoon, a line in a breeze could do much of that work. A freezing day was less cooperative. Wet fabric exposed to sufficiently cold air could freeze stiff. Shirts and sheets might harden on the line before enough moisture escaped. The sight could be almost comic. Clothing shaped by the wind and cold into rigid forms. But the person responsible for the laundry still needed dry clothes eventually. Items might remain outside until conditions improved. or drying could continue indoors, where heat from the stove or fireplace offered help. Indoor drying created its own complications. Space was valuable. Damp cloth released moisture into rooms that might already suffer from condensation and poor ventilation. Large garments occupied enormous amounts of room. A sheet was not just a sheet anymore. It was a temporary wall. Even after the laundry dried, the work might not be finished. 19th-century irons were literal pieces of heated metal. Flat irons could be placed near or on a stove until hot enough to press cloth. Some households used several irons so one could heat while another was being used. Temperature had to be judged without a digital display. Too cool, and the iron accomplished little. Too hot, and fabric could scorch. The iron itself was heavy, which meant pressing clothing required another round of repetitive arm and shoulder work. Handles could become uncomfortable. Soot or dirt on the iron surface could undo part of the washing if it marked clean cloth. So the supposedly simple journey from dirty shirt to wearable shirt might involve fetching water, splitting or carrying fuel, building heat, preparing soap, soaking, scrubbing, rinsing, wringing, carrying, hanging, freezing, drying, heating an iron, pressing, folding, and mending. And mending mattered because frontier clothing was valuable. A torn shirt was not automatically replaced. A missing button did not justify throwing away the garment. Socks developed holes, seams opened, knees wore thin. Children's clothing became too small long before the fabric became useless. Women patched, darned, altered, reused, and repurposed. Older garments could pass downward through a family. Fabric too worn for respectable clothing might become work clothing, patches, quilting material, cleaning cloths, or something else entirely. Nothing about this was unusual. That may be the most revealing part. The extraordinary physical effort hidden inside laundry was ordinary enough that people built weekly routines around it. And while one tub was being emptied and another kettle was heating, the stove still needed fuel, the children still needed attention, meals still had to be planned, animals still had to be checked, and tomorrow's work was already beginning to form. Because on the frontier, finishing one chore rarely meant you were finished. It usually meant the next chore finally had room to begin. The clothes might finally be drying, but the kitchen had already started asking for attention again. On a frontier farm, cooking was not confined to breakfast and supper. Food preparation stretched across the day because so many ingredients arrived in forms that required work before they could become meals. Grain might need grinding, vegetables had to be cleaned, peeled, cut or sorted. Meat could require trimming, soaking, salting or slow cooking. Milk led to butter, cream, cheese and other products only if someone processed it before it spoiled. Cold weather changed the pace, but it did not remove the work. In some ways, winter added another layer. A root cellar might protect potatoes, carrots, turnips, apples, cabbage, and other stored foods from severe freezing. But someone still had to go outside or descend into that storage space to retrieve them. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salted meat, preserved fruit, and other staples could be kept indoors or in protected storage, depending on the household. There was no refrigerated door to open. There was a geography of food. Some things were in the pantry. Others were in barrels, crocks, sacks, cellar shelves, smokehouses, sheds, or outbuildings. A woman preparing one meal might cross several different spaces simply to assemble its ingredients. And because frontier households could be separated from stores by considerable distances, running out of something was not always a minor inconvenience. You adapted. This made preservation one of the hidden foundations of winter life. Long before the first hard freeze, women had already been preparing for it. Fruits could be dried, preserved, or made into jams and preserves. Vegetables might be dried, pickled, stored in cellars, or otherwise kept according to what was available and what local conditions allowed. Meat could be salted, smoked, dried, or preserved through cold weather. Every preserved item represented work moved forward in time. Summer labour became winter food. That relationship mattered because winter sharply reduced what could be gathered fresh from gardens and fields. The household began consuming the results of decisions made months earlier. A poor harvest followed everyone indoors. So, did a successful one? Meals on many farms were based on relatively simple ingredients, but simplicity did not necessarily mean speed. Beans could require long cooking. Tough cuts of meat benefited from hours of heat. Bread depended on mixing, kneading, rising, shaping and baking. Cornmeal could become mush, breads, cakes or other dishes, depending on regional habits. And controlling a 19th-century stove demanded experience. A wood-burning cook stove did not come with a numbered temperature dial. Heat depended on the fire, airflow, fuel, stove design, and where a pot or pan sat on the cooking surface. Different areas could be hotter than others. Damp wood behaved differently from properly seasoned fuel. The cook learned by observation. She watched the fire. She felt heat. She moved cookware. She adjusted dampers. She added wood. She judged whether something was cooking too quickly or too slowly. Recipes from the period often assumed that kind of knowledge because the person using them was expected to understand her own equipment. And instructions such as baking in a quick oven or moderate oven made sense to someone who had learned to read heat through experience. That experience was acquired through repetition, and mistakes were expensive. Burning dinner did not merely mean ordering something else. Food represented money and labour. Fuel represented labour too. Even ashes had value. Hardwood ashes could be collected and used in making lye, which in turn could be combined with fat to produce soap. This meant the remains of yesterday's fire could become part of another household process instead of simply being discarded. Soap making itself could be demanding and potentially dangerous. Traditional soft soap production often involved leaching water through wood ashes to create an alkaline solution and then combining that lye with animal fat. Concentrated lye could burn skin, so the process required care, knowledge, and judgment. Again, frontier women were working with chemistry, whether anyone called it chemistry or not. They understood through practice how fat behaved, how soap changed, how preservation worked, how yeast responded to temperature, how milk soured, how fabric reacted to heat, and how different fuels burned. Household knowledge was technical knowledge. It simply arrived, without a laboratory coat. Winter made that knowledge even more valuable, because the environment was less forgiving. Consider bread. Yeast becomes less active when conditions are cold. A dough that might rise comfortably during warmer weather could move slowly in a chilly room. The practical response was to find warmth without overheating it. Near the stove, perhaps. In a protected part of the kitchen. Wrapped or covered. Close enough to benefit from heat, but not so close that the dough was damaged. Then there was the oven itself. Timing had to match temperature. At the same time, someone might be stirring a pot, watching children, adding fuel, preparing vegetables, washing dishes, carrying water, feeding poultry, or handling dairy work. The image of a woman quietly cooking one dish at a time belongs more comfortably to a demonstration kitchen than to a working household. Real domestic labour overlapped. That overlap becomes especially obvious when animals enter the picture. Many frontier households depended on cows, chickens, pigs, horses, and other livestock. Not every woman performed every animal-related task, and divisions of labour differed greatly from family to family. But women commonly milked cows, cared for poultry, gathered eggs, processed dairy products, and sometimes performed much heavier farm work when needed. A freezing morning did not persuade a cow to postpone milking. If a family relied on milk, the routine followed the animal. Barns and sheds could provide shelter, but they were not modern heated buildings. A woman walking from the house to a barn carried the warmth of the kitchen only as far as her clothing could hold it. Milking required stillness. That may sound easier than carrying water until you remember the temperature. Hands had to work in the cold. The stool was cold, the bucket was cold, metal was unpleasant to touch, breath condensed in the air, hay, manure, dampness, and animal heat mixed into the atmosphere of the barn. Then the milk had to come back to the house. And raw milk did not automatically become butter. Cream had to separate. Churning turned that cream into butter through repeated agitation. The butter then had to be gathered, washed, worked, and often salted. Another repetitive motion. Another food that looked simple only after the work disappeared. Chickens created their own winter problems. Egg production could decline as daylight shortened. Water for poultry could freeze. Feed still had to be supplied. Eggs had to be collected before cold damaged them. The same principle applied throughout the farm. Living things continued making demands. That is what made a frontier winter morning so relentless. Cold did not replace ordinary labour with some dramatic emergency. Cold attached itself to ordinary labour. It made the pump harder to use. It made the floor colder underfoot. It slowed yeast. It froze drinking water. It stiffened laundry. It increased the demand for firewood. It turned a short walk to the barn into something requiring layers, boots, and determination. And then, almost invisibly, it consumed time. A few extra minutes lighting the stove. A few more breaking ice. Another trip for wood. Another kettle heated. Another garment moved indoors. Another animal checked. By itself, none of these delays seems important. Stack them across an entire day, and winter begins to reveal its real cost. Not one great hardship, hundreds of small ones. By late morning, the house itself had become another job. Frontier homes varied enormously. Some families lived in log cabins, others occupied frame houses, adobe buildings, dugouts, sod houses, military quarters, or temporary shelters while something more permanent was being built. Conditions in Pennsylvania were not identical to those in Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, Montana, or the Pacific Northwest. But winter exposed the weaknesses of almost every dwelling. Cold air found gaps. Wind pushed beneath doors. Frost appeared on windows. Snow entered places where roofs or walls were imperfect. A stove might warm one room reasonably well while leaving another painfully cold. For women performing domestic work, that meant the house was not simply the protected space where chores happened. The house itself had to be managed against the weather. Heating was the obvious problem. A fire needed fuel throughout the day, and fuel had its own chain of labour behind it. Trees had to be felled or deadwood collected. Logs had to be cut into usable lengths. Wood had to be split. It had to be transported and stored where it could remain dry enough to burn well. The exact division of this labour depended on the household. Men and older boys often performed much of the cutting and splitting, especially the heaviest work. But women and children also carried fuel, gathered smaller pieces, collected chips, and kept indoor supplies replenished. On treeless plains, the problem could be more severe. Wood might be scarce or expensive. Families used whatever combustible material their environment provided. On sections of the Great Plains, dried buffalo dung became an important fuel for emigrants and settlers. Travellers commonly called these pieces buffalo chips. Dried cattle manure could later serve the same purpose in areas where timber remained scarce. To modern ears, the idea of collecting manure for the kitchen fire sounds especially miserable. To someone crossing an open landscape with little wood, it was energy lying on the ground. Women and children on overland trails frequently gathered buffalo chips while camps were being made. The fuel burned quickly and differently from good hardwood, but it could heat food and boil water. The frontier demanded flexibility more often than elegance. Inside the house, heat had to be rationed by architecture. A small stove could not warm every corner equally. Families learned which rooms were worth heating and which could remain cold. Doors might stay closed. Sleeping spaces could be chilly enough that getting into bed required determination rather than relaxation. The kitchen often became the centre of winter life, because that was where the fire already had a practical reason to burn. Cooking generated warmth. Boiling laundry water generated warmth. Heating irons generated warmth. People gathered near the same source because creating a second warm space required more fuel. This produced an unusual winter rhythm. The warmest room was also one of the busiest. Children crossed it. Wet clothing dried there. Food cooked there. Water heated there. Boots collected near the entrance. Firewood shed bark and dirt. Ash escaped the stove. Grease and smoke settled onto surfaces. Keeping the room clean therefore required continuous work. Floors were especially vulnerable. People entered carrying snow, mud, manure, straw, and whatever else adhered to footwear. In rougher dwellings, floors might begin as packed earth before wooden flooring became available. Where plank floors existed, they still needed sweeping and sometimes scrubbing. A broom was not a decorative object. It was infrastructure. Commercially manufactured brooms became increasingly available during the 19th century, but households also used locally made sweeping tools, depending on time and place. Repeated sweeping kept dirt from becoming part of the interior landscape. Scrubbing was another matter. Once again, water had to be carried. Once again, water might need heating. Once again, someone had to bend down and supply the mechanical force. A clean floor was the visible end of another invisible chain. Dusting and washing surfaces also mattered because heating and cooking generated their own dirt. Wood stoves produced ash. Open fires produced smoke and soot. Kerosene lamps, increasingly common later in the century, could leave soot if poorly adjusted. Lighting deserves attention because winter reduced daylight itself. At northern latitudes especially, mornings began late and evenings arrived early. Chores did not politely fit inside the available sunlight. Before widespread electric lighting, families relied on daylight, fireplaces, candles, oil lamps, and later increasingly kerosene lamps. Artificial light was expensive enough to shape behavior. A candle was fuel. Lamp oil was fuel. Kerosene was fuel. Using light therefore consumed a resource. That encouraged households to organize some work around daylight whenever possible. Fine sewing was easier when the sun was available. Sorting, mending, reading, and other visual tasks benefited from windows. But winter could force work into the darker hours. And then there was mending. Almost every household produced a steady stream of damaged fabric. A seam split. A button disappeared. A stocking wore through at the heel. A child's sleeve became too short. A work shirt tore. An apron thinned. A blanket frayed. The response was usually not immediate replacement. Clothing represented too much material and labour for that. Before inexpensive mass-produced garments became widely accessible, much household clothing either had to be made at home, altered at home, or at least maintained there. Even as ready-made clothing expanded during the 19th century, rural families continued repairing garments because replacement still cost money. Mending was therefore an economy of tiny rescues. A few stitches extended the life of a shirt. A patch saved trousers. Darning closed a hole in a stocking by rebuilding the missing area with thread. Old fabric supplied patches for newer fabric. Buttons were saved. Scraps were saved. Nothing useful was discarded casually if it might solve a later problem. The sewing basket became a small archive of former objects. A piece of an old dress might eventually repair an apron. A worn shirt could become a rag. Better scraps could enter a quilt. A garment too small for one child might be altered for another. Material flowed downward through stages of usefulness until very little remained worth saving. Winter encouraged this work because field demands were lower in many farming households, while long evenings provided time for indoor textile tasks. But calling those evenings restful would be misleading. Women knitted stockings, repaired clothes, sewed garments, pieced quilts, spun fibre in households where spinning remained necessary, or worked on whatever textile job could be completed near the available light. Hands kept moving. That phrase could describe much of frontier women's work. Even sitting did not necessarily mean stopping. A woman might rock a cradle with one foot while sewing. She might mend clothing while supervising children. She might shell beans during conversation. She might churn while watching another pot. She might knit during an evening that someone later remembered as leisure. The line between working and not working was remarkably thin. Children added another layer to every task. A mother did not stop being responsible for young children because laundry was heavy or bread required attention. Babies needed feeding. Toddlers wandered toward fires, tools, doors, animals, and hot water. Older children could help. They fetched wood, carried smaller buckets, gathered eggs, watched younger siblings, swept floors, prepared vegetables, fed chickens, armed increasingly substantial work as they grew. A frontier household functioned partly because labour expanded downward through the family. Childhood contained play, affection, schooling, and exploration, but it could also contain responsibilities that modern families might assign to adults. And the mother often stood at the centre of this network, not necessarily performing every task herself, but keeping track of what had been done and what had not. Was there enough wood? Had the bread risen? Did the cow need attention? Were the stockings dry? Was the baby asleep? Was supper started? Had someone brought water? Did that torn coat need repairing before tomorrow? These were not separate questions. They overlapped in real time. That may be the hardest part of frontier domestic work to reproduce in a museum display. A stove can be preserved. A washboard can be displayed. An iron can sit behind glass. But the true burden was simultaneity. Nothing waited politely for something else to finish. The fire burned while the dough rose. The baby woke while the floor was wet. The cow needed milking while supper was cooking. The water bucket emptied while laundry was soaking. And outside, the temperature kept falling. There was another winter task that could not be postponed for long, because unlike a dirty floor or a torn sleeve, it involved something alive standing outside and waiting. Livestock had to survive the same weather as the household. For many frontier families, animals were not simply property. They were part of the food system, transportation system, labour system, and household economy all at once. A cow could provide milk, chickens produced eggs and eventually meat, pigs transformed scraps and grain into valuable food, horses and oxen supplied transportation and pulling power. Keeping those animals alive through winter protected much more than the animals themselves. It protected the family's ability to function. That made the morning trip outside unavoidable. A woman might leave a warming kitchen and step directly into air cold enough to sting exposed skin. Depending on region and circumstance, there might be snow against the building, frozen mud beneath it, or a wind moving almost unobstructed across open land. The barn offered shelter, but shelter did not mean warmth. Animal bodies produced heat. Hay provided insulation. Walls blocked some wind, yet barns, sheds, and stables were generally not heated in the modern sense. Inside, winter remained winter. Milking was one of the clearest examples of work that followed a biological schedule rather than personal convenience. A dairy cow could not simply be ignored until noon because the morning was unpleasant. Milking routines depended on the household and animal, but regularity mattered. If a family relied on fresh milk, butter, or cream, somebody had to perform that work consistently. Women often did. The process required close contact with an animal whose cooperation was useful but never guaranteed. The cow had to be secured or kept calm. The udder had to be handled. A pail had to remain positioned where a shifting hoof would not overturn it. Then the milker sat low beside the animal and worked by hand. Repeated pressure, release, pressure, release, again and again, until the milk flow diminished. In cold weather, the contrast could be strange. The barn air might be freezing, but the milk arrived warm from the cow. That warmth would not last. The full pail then had to be carried carefully back toward the house or processing area without contamination or spillage. Milk was valuable enough to deserve attention immediately. Before refrigeration, families relied on cool storage, cellars, spring houses, winter temperatures, and rapid processing to control spoilage. The exact methods varied with climate and household resources. Some milk was consumed fresh. Some became cream. Some cream became butter. And butter added another piece of repetitive labor to the day. Churning worked because continuous agitation caused fat globules in cream to join together. Eventually, after enough movement, small grains of butter appeared and gathered into larger masses. The principle sounds simple. The experience was monotonous. Depending on the churn and conditions, the handle, dasher, or mechanism had to be moved repeatedly while the cream slowly changed. Temperature mattered too. Cream that was too cold or too warm could make the process less cooperative. Frontier women learned the useful range through practical experience rather than a digital thermometer displaying the answer. When butter finally formed, the job still continued. The butter had to be separated from the buttermilk. Then it was worked and washed to remove remaining liquid. Salt might be added both for flavor and preservation. After that, the finished butter needed storage. What arrived on the table as a small yellow portion therefore represented feeding a cow, watering the cow, milking it, handling the milk, separating or collecting cream, churning, washing, working, salting and storing. The food was compact. Its labor was not. Chickens created a different rhythm. They needed feed and water, and freezing temperatures complicated both. A water container that functioned perfectly in warm weather could become a block of ice after a sufficiently cold night. Someone had to notice. Ice might have to be broken or removed. Fresh water might need to be carried out. That created one of winter's recurring absurdities, hauling liquid water into an environment determined to make it solid. Then there were eggs. Hens often laid fewer eggs during the shorter daylight of winter, particularly without the artificial lighting used in later commercial poultry operations. That made each winter egg more useful, not less. Eggs left exposed to severe freezing could be damaged, so collecting them mattered. The nesting area also needed some degree of cleanliness, and poultry houses required attention, even when the wind outside suggested that every reasonable creature should remain indoors. Pigs, horses, and other animals brought additional demands. Feed had to be distributed. Hay had to be moved. Stalls needed cleaning. Bedding had to be replaced. Water had to remain accessible. An animal that became sick or injured created work immediately, regardless of what else had been planned. This is where the neat historical division between male farm work and female housework begins to break apart. Some households did divide work strongly by gender. Men might handle ploughing, heavy wood cutting, fencing, and much of the large livestock work, while women concentrated on dairy, poultry, food, clothing, children, and the interior household. But frontier circumstances were rarely tidy enough to preserve every boundary. Illness changed the division. Pregnancy changed it. Widowhood changed it. Absence changed it. Harvest pressure changed it. A husband leaving for town, military service, mining, seasonal employment, or another necessity could transfer unfamiliar work onto whoever remained. Women drove wagons. They managed farms. They planted and harvested. They milked, butchered, preserved food, repaired clothing, cared for livestock, and sometimes handled business accounts. Thousands also claimed land in their own right. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, an unmarried woman who met the legal requirements could file a claim just as an unmarried man could. Widows could also become claimants. Over the following decades, women became a significant minority of homesteaders. Obtaining land, however, did not mean merely receiving a piece of paper. A claimant had to meet residence and improvement requirements. The land had to become a functioning home and productive claim. That meant women's frontier labour was sometimes not merely supportive of someone else's ownership. It could be the labour by which they established ownership themselves. And winter tested that claim brutally. A field that appeared peaceful beneath snow still represented future work. Fences damaged by storms would need repair. Stored seed needed protection. Animals were consuming hay that had been cut and stored months earlier. Firewood piles were shrinking. Preserved food stores were shrinking. The household was living off reserves. Winter therefore turned storage into arithmetic. Not mathematics written on a school slate, but practical calculation repeated every day. How much flour remained? How much wood? How much hay? How much salt meat? How many potatoes were beginning to spoil? Was there enough lamp fuel? Could another trip to town be delayed? Would the chickens require purchased grain? Could a worn coat survive another season? The family might not keep every calculation on paper, but someone had to notice the trend. Women managing household supplies often developed an intimate understanding of scarcity because they encountered it in small quantities first. The flour bin became lighter. The soap piece became thinner. The candle supply declined. The wood box emptied faster during a cold spell. A child grew out of boots before winter ended. There is something important here about the nature of frontier hardship. It was not always spectacular. Often it appeared as depletion. A household had enough today. The question was whether it would still have enough 3 weeks from now. And every freezing morning consumed a little more of what had been stored against the season. More wood. More feed. More lamp oil. More preserved food. More strength. The work of a frontier woman was therefore partly the work of maintaining flows, bringing water in, sending waste out, bringing fuel in, turning raw food into meals, turning dirty cloth into clean cloth, turning cream into butter, turning scraps into repairs, and turning stored supplies into another completed day. Nothing remained still for long. Even the house that looked quiet beneath winter snow was constantly consuming resources and producing work. And before the sun had climbed very high, the woman moving between stove, table, barn, woodpile, water source and wash area had already crossed that invisible landscape many times. The day was not yet half over, but the morning had already demanded almost everything. By the middle of the day, the frontier household had usually produced something else that needed management. Waste. Ash from the stove, dirty water from washing, food scraps, animal manure, broken objects, bones, grease, soiled cloth. Nothing vanished because someone carried it to a curb. A household had to decide what could be reused, what could be burned, what could be fed to animals, what could be composted or returned to the ground, and what simply had to be hauled away. That made disposal another form of labour. Take the stove. A fire that supplied warmth and cooking also produced ash every day. Too much ash interfered with airflow and reduced the stove's performance, so it had to be removed periodically. But hot embers could remain hidden inside apparently harmless grey material. Carelessness could start a fire. Ash, therefore, had to be handled with attention, often placed in a metal container or deposited somewhere safe away from combustible walls, hay, wood piles, and dry grass. Yet ashes could also be useful. Hardwood ash contained alkaline compounds that could be leached with water to produce a solution used in traditional soap making. On farms, ash could also find agricultural or cleaning uses, depending on local practice. So the remains of the cooking fire might move into another household cycle. Grease followed a similar path. Today, kitchen fat is easily treated as waste. In a frontier household, usable animal fat had value. Rendered fat could be incorporated into cooking, candles, soap, and other practical products. After butchering, therefore, fat was not automatically discarded. It could be cut, heated slowly, and rendered so that liquid fat separated from connective tissue and impurities. Once strained and cooled, it could be stored. The smell of rendering fat was not necessarily pleasant, but pleasantness was rarely the deciding question. Usefulness was. Soap brought fat and ash together in one of the most practical household transformations. Store-bought soap became increasingly available during the 19th century, especially where transportation and commercial networks were strong, but homemade soap remained important in many rural households. The basic ingredients could come directly from farm life. Wood produced ash. Livestock produced fat. Water completed the mixture. The chemical reaction between an alkali and fat created soap, though household makers understood the process through recipes, experience, and observation rather than modern chemical notation. Obtaining the lye was itself a process. Ashes could be packed into a barrel, hopper, or similar container. Water passed through them and collected below, carrying dissolved alkaline compounds with it. The resulting liquid had to be strong enough to work properly. Historical methods for judging strength could be surprisingly practical. Some traditional instructions described testing whether an egg, potato, or other object floated to a particular degree in the solution. These tests were imperfect by modern laboratory standards, but they represented a working attempt to measure concentration with available tools. Then came the dangerous part. Strong lye is caustic. It can damage skin and eyes. Soap making therefore demanded caution, especially in households where children, animals, open fires, and cramped work areas might all be nearby. The lye and rendered fat were combined under controlled conditions and worked until the mixture changed. Soft soap could be stored in barrels or containers and used for household cleaning and laundry. Again, the finished product concealed the work behind it. A spoonful of soap represented firewood, ash collection, water, animal fat, rendering, leaching, heating, mixing, and careful storage. This habit of turning byproducts back into resources appeared throughout frontier domestic life. Scraps from food preparation could feed chickens or pigs. Bones might be boiled before disposal to extract remaining nourishment. Worn cloth became rags or patches. Broken garments became material. Feathers could be saved for bedding. Corn cobs might become fuel in some places. Nothing required a grand philosophy of conservation. Scarcity taught the lesson automatically. If replacement was expensive, distant, or unavailable, throwing away something useful made little sense. This extended to household objects. A cracked handle could be replaced. A loose chair could be repaired. A pot might remain in service despite dents. A basket could be patched. A broken piece of machinery could surrender parts to another repair. Women were often directly involved in this culture of maintenance, even when certain repairs were divided among other household members. Their work required constant judgment about remaining usefulness. Was the cloth strong enough for another patch? Could the grease still be rendered? Could yesterday's bread become part of another dish? Was a jar still sound enough for storage? Could a worn sheet be cut down for another purpose? The goal was not to preserve objects forever. It was to extract as much usefulness as reasonably possible before replacement became unavoidable. Winter intensified that instinct because travel could be difficult. A general store might be only several miles away on a map, but distance meant something different when roads were muddy, snow-covered, frozen, or poorly maintained. A shopping trip consumed time. It required transportation. Horses needed feed. Weather had to cooperate. Someone had to leave other work unfinished. And the store itself could sell only what had successfully travelled through the same transportation network. Railroads transformed access dramatically in many regions during the 19th century, but settlement repeatedly moved beyond the most convenient supply lines. New communities often existed at the edge of distribution. That meant households tried to anticipate needs. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, tea, spices, lamp fuel, needles, thread, fabric, soap when it was purchased, hardware, medicines, Matches, as they became commonplace. Every trip to town could become a logistical event rather than a casual errand. Women therefore made lists, mentally or on paper, compared household needs against available money, and decided which items were essential. Cash itself could be scarce. A farm might produce substantial food while generating relatively little money at certain times of year. That made women's household production economically important in ways that can disappear from official records. Eggs could be sold, butter could be sold, cream could be sold, vegetables, baked goods, sewing, boarding services, laundry, and other forms of labour could generate cash or exchange value. A woman might manage what historians sometimes describe as an egg and butter economy, turning small agricultural products into money used for household purchases. Those small transactions mattered. A few dozen eggs might become thread. Butter might help pay for coffee or sugar. Sewing income could purchase shoes. Laundry money could increase a family's flexibility. The domestic sphere was therefore not isolated from the market. It fed into it. At frontier military posts, this connection becomes especially visible through professional laundresses. A laundress might perform work that resembled ordinary household labour, but she did it for paying customers. Soldiers required clean clothing. The army needed that work performed. Women supplied the service. This gave some laundresses an unusual degree of recognised economic status within military communities. Their position did not remove hardship. The work remained physically punishing. They still hauled water, heated it, scrubbed garments, managed fuel, dried clothing, and dealt with weather. But money changed the meaning of the labour. A washboard became a tool of income. A kettle became part of a business. Domestic skill became marketable expertise. And that complicates the familiar image of frontier women working quietly inside a private household. Their labour crossed boundaries constantly. Home and farm, family and market, production and consumption, indoor and outdoor work, paid and unpaid labour. On freezing mornings, those categories mattered less than the next practical question. What needed doing now? A fire required feeding. A customer needed clean shirts. A child needed a repaired mitten. A pig could use the kitchen scraps. Ash needed removing. Soap was running low. Butter might be ready for market. The household survived partly because very little remained. Only one thing. Fat could become soap. Ash could become lye. Cloth could become a patch. Milk could become butter. Eggs could become cash. Cash could become coffee. And all of it depended on someone seeing value where a modern household might simply see waste. That ability to keep materials moving through one useful life after another was not merely thrift. On the frontier, especially in winter, it was part of staying supplied until the next trip, the next harvest, the next paycheck, or the next thaw. Cold weather also exposed something less visible than firewood, food, or laundry. It exposed clothing. A frontier woman could not spend a winter morning moving between a heated stove, an icy well, a drafty barn, and an open yard without thinking carefully about what stood between her body and the weather. Yet 19th-century winter clothing did not work like modern outdoor gear. There were no lightweight synthetic insulation layers, waterproof breathable shells, fleece pullovers, or insulated rubber boots designed in laboratories. Warmth came from natural fibres, multiple layers, heavy fabrics, knitted garments, shawls, cloaks, coats, stockings, mittens, and whatever a household could obtain, make, repair, or adapt. Wool mattered enormously because it retained useful insulating properties even when damp. Flannel could add warmth close to the body. Women might wear several layers beneath an outer garment, and those layers had to accommodate the clothing conventions of the period, as well as the practical demands of work. For much of the 19th century, a woman's daily clothing could include a shift or chemise, drawers depending on period and personal practice, petticoats, stockings, a dress or separate bodice and skirt, an apron, and additional cold weather layers. That sounds like substantial protection. Sometimes it was. But more clothing also meant more cloth to wash, dry, repair, and protect. Long skirts created particular problems outdoors. Snow could cling to hems. Mud could soak fabric. A skirt brushing across barn floors. Yards, paths, and doorways collected evidence of everywhere its wearer had been. Women adapted. Working skirts could be pinned or lifted when necessary. Aprons protected better clothing from grease, ash, food, dirt, and water. Older garments could be reserved for rough labour. Heavy shawls, capes, hoods, bonnets, knitted coverings, and coats supplied additional warmth according to what a woman owned. Fashion did not disappear on the frontier, but practicality had a powerful vote. Footwear was perhaps even more important. A wet foot in freezing weather becomes miserable quickly. Leather shoes and boots could be treated with grease or other preparations to improve water resistance, but they were not equivalent to modern waterproof boots. Snow entered around openings. Leather stiffened. Soles wore out. Stockings provided insulation, often woolen in winter where available, but wet stockings became another item demanding drying space near the fire. That produced an evening ritual familiar to many cold-weather households. Wet things gathered around heat. Mittens, stockings, boots, children's clothing, scarves, coats, perhaps a skirt hem dampened by snow. The household might look almost as if it were trying to dry itself. But fire created danger along with warmth. Clothing placed too close could scorch. Sparks from an open hearth could ignite fabric. Long skirts were especially hazardous around flames. Before enclosed stoves became widespread, women working at open fireplaces spent enormous amounts of time close to fire while wearing garments made from combustible materials. Accidental burns were a serious domestic danger. Even with a stove, boiling water, heated irons, kettles, hot grease, and metal surfaces presented risks. The kitchen was a workplace built around heat, and many of its workers were carrying babies. Childcare did not take place in a separate nursery staffed by someone else. A woman might prepare food with an infant nearby, supervise toddlers while tending the stove, or stop repeatedly to nurse, soothe, wash, dress, and feed a young child. Babies generated laundry at a rate that could make even ordinary wash day seem generous. Before disposable diapers, cloth had to be washed. Again and again. Soiled cloth did not vanish into a sealed bin and reappear clean. It entered the same water and fire system as everything else. Rinse it, wash it, boil or treat it according to household practice. Rinse it again, dry it, reuse it. Winter made the cycle harder because drying took longer. This is one reason the experience of frontier women varied so dramatically according to family size. A household with several small children produced an entirely different volume of cooking, washing, sewing, cleaning, and care than a household containing 2 adults. Every additional person consumed food, produced dirty dishes, produced dirty clothing, needed bedding, required warmth, might become sick. An illness could disrupt the entire labour system. A winter cold was one thing. Influenza, pneumonia, diphtheria, scarlet fever, measles, or another serious disease could transform an already demanding household into a place of continuous nursing. Medical help might be distant. A physician could require hours of travel. Weather could make that journey difficult or impossible. Many women therefore carried substantial practical medical knowledge. They recognized common symptoms, prepared simple remedies, managed fevers, changed bedding, cleaned wounds, sat beside sick children, kept fires burning through the night. None of this guarantees that treatments were effective by modern standards. 19th century medicine itself contained many practices later shown to be useless or harmful. But the responsibility remained. Someone had to care for the patient. Usually, that care created additional work for the same person already managing the household. A sick child did not reduce the need for water. It increased it. Bedding became dirty more quickly. Clothing needed changing. Broths and other foods might be prepared separately. The patient needed warmth. Someone might lose sleep. And then morning arrived on schedule. This is where the physical burden of frontier women's labour begins to merge with another kind of exhaustion. There was rarely a clean boundary between shifts. Modern workers often imagine labour as something with a beginning and an end. You arrive, perform the job, and eventually leave. Domestic labour followed a different clock. The fire could need attention after dark. A baby might wake at midnight. An animal could become distressed. A storm might damage part of the house. Someone could become ill. Bread preparation might begin before breakfast. Laundry preparations might start the night before wash day. Women could sleep in the same building where almost all their responsibilities waited. There was no commute separating worker from workplace. The workplace surrounded the bed. Winter sharpened this because the household itself needed supervision overnight. Allowing a fire to die completely meant facing a colder morning. Keeping it burning required either banking coals carefully or rising to tend it. Different households managed nighttime heat in different ways, balancing fuel consumption against comfort and safety. Heavy bedding helped. Feather beds, quilts, blankets, woven coverlets, and other layers trapped body heat, sometimes more efficiently than trying to heat an entire room through the night. Bedding represented another storehouse of women's labour. Quilts could be assembled from purchased fabric, saved scraps, older clothing, or carefully selected pieces. Their construction required cutting, arranging, piecing, stitching, filling or layering, and quilting. A finished quilt was practical insulation. It was also hundreds or thousands of stitches. Feather bedding required feathers to be collected, cleaned, and accumulated. Wool blankets began with sheep and passed through a long chain of processing before becoming useful household textiles. Even sleep depended on production. And when blankets wore thin, women repaired them. When children's clothing became too small, women altered it. When mittens developed holes, someone darned them because a hole in a winter mitten was not merely unattractive, it allowed cold directly onto skin. Prairie therefore became part of winter protection. A tiny missing patch of fabric could matter. So women watched clothes deteriorate almost the way they watched food stores decline. Which stocking would fail next? Which coat could survive another month? Did the children have enough dry layers for tomorrow? Was there spare cloth? Could the old wool dress provide usable material? A household might appear fully dressed while constantly operating one tier away from another repair, and behind every warm body stood a chain of maintenance. Clothing had to be acquired, then protected, then washed, then dried, then patched, then handed down, then cut apart, then reused. Eventually, only scraps remained. Those scraps might still clean a lamp chimney, wipe grease from a pan, help stuff something, or catch dirt around the kitchen. The garment disappeared. The material continued working. That was frontier thrift at its most intimate. Not a charming habit. Not a decorative celebration of simplicity. A practical response to a world in which almost everything took longer to replace than it took to wear out. And on a freezing morning, when the woman at the centre of that world buttoned, wrapped, pinned, tied, and layered herself before stepping outside again, she was carrying the results of countless earlier hours of labour directly on her body. The clothes were tools. The blankets were tools. The fire was a tool. And warmth itself was something the household had to manufacture maintain, and defend. Some freezing mornings did not begin inside a permanent house at all. For thousands of women moving west during the 19th century, the morning could begin beneath canvas. Overland migration created a harsher version of domestic labour because the ordinary machinery of home had been stripped down and placed on wheels. There might be no kitchen, no fixed stove, no pantry, no reliable well, no familiar barn, and no permanent place to dry clothing. Yet people still needed breakfast. They still needed water. Children still became dirty. Clothing still tore. Someone still had to cook. The wagon did not eliminate household labour. It made the household mobile. Women travelling routes such as the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails carried responsibilities that often resembled the work they had performed at home, but they now did those tasks beside roads, rivers, open plains, mountain passes, and temporary camps. A cold morning could begin before sunrise. The first difficulty was often getting a fire. Where timber was available, emigrants could collect wood. Across stretches of the Great Plains, however fuel might be scarce, dried buffalo dung became so useful that gathering it was an ordinary part of travel. Women and children often collected the chips. There is something wonderfully unromantic about this detail. Popular images of Western migration tend to favour wagons beneath dramatic skies. The actual journey also involved searching the ground for dry manure because somebody needed to boil coffee. Buffalo chips could burn hot enough to cook with, but they burned relatively quickly. That meant the cook had to understand the fuel she had rather than the fuel she wished she had. Wind made things harder. A fire in an open landscape could be difficult to start and maintain. The cook might use the wagon, a bank, a shallow depression, or another barrier to create shelter from the wind when possible. Then came water. Travellers planned camps around access to it whenever they could, but the quality varied enormously. A clear stream was valuable. A muddy river was still water. A shallow or contaminated source could become dangerous. People shared waterways with animals, other wagon companies, and settlements. Upstream activity affected everyone downstream. Women often had to make practical judgments about water because they were the ones using it repeatedly for cooking and washing. Boiling offered some protection from biological contamination, although 19th century emigrants did not possess modern germ theory during much of the period of major overland migration. They could observe consequences without fully understanding microorganisms. Bad water could make people sick. That much became painfully obvious. On a freezing morning, even reaching the water source could be unpleasant. Riverbanks might be icy. Buckets had to be carried back to camp. Cold fingers handled wet containers. Then breakfast began with whatever remained accessible. Flour, cornmeal, bacon, beans, coffee, dried fruit, salt, perhaps fresh meat when available. The exact foods varied with the wagon company, family, route, season, and stage of the journey. Early in the trip, supplies could feel plentiful. Months later, wagon capacity imposed arithmetic on the entire household. Everything carried west had weight. Food had weight. Water had weight. Tools had weight. Clothing had weight. Furniture had weight. The wagon itself had limits. Families sometimes began with possessions they considered essential and gradually abandoned things beside the trail when animals weakened or terrain became more demanding. Furniture, trunks, tools, books, cookware. Objects that had seemed important at departure could become obstacles when an overloaded wagon had to climb. Women watched pieces of household life fall away, but their labour remained. Cooking equipment became especially valuable because meals still had to be prepared every day. A Dutch oven, skillet, kettle, coffee pot, tinware, knives, and other simple tools could support an astonishing amount of domestic work. And those tools had to be packed and unpacked repeatedly. Morning after morning. Camp was dismantled. Travel began. Then camp had to be constructed again. This turned housekeeping into something almost nomadic. There was no floor to sweep in the conventional sense, but bedding had to be aired or packed. Cooking vessels had to be cleaned. Food had to be protected from dirt, insects, weather, and animals. Clothes required washing whenever circumstances allowed. Children needed supervision around wagons, livestock, rivers, fires, and unfamiliar terrain. Women who were pregnant or caring for infants faced all of those demands while travelling. Diaries and reminiscences from the overland trails repeatedly reveal how little the journey adjusted itself for illness, menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, or childcare. The wagon train generally had to keep moving. Birth could happen during migration. Then, when mother and baby were able, travel resumed. This does not mean every woman immediately returned to full labour after giving birth. Families and fellow travellers could assist, and individual circumstances varied enormously. But the trail offered little institutional support. There was no maternity ward waiting beyond the next hill. Even ordinary privacy was difficult. Hundreds of miles of open landscape might surround a traveller, yet a wagon company was a crowded social world. Families camped near one another. People ate, slept, washed, argued, became ill, and cared for bodies within sight or hearing of others. Women had to find workable routines inside that lack of privacy. Laundry was one of the clearest compromises. A river provided water, but getting clothing clean required time that competed with travel. If the wagon company stopped for a rest day, women might use the opportunity to wash. The familiar sequence returned. Water, soap, scrubbing, rinsing, drying. Except now the wash area might be a riverbank, and the clothesline might be whatever rope, wagon side, bush, or improvised support was available. Cold weather could turn wet clothing rigid just as it did on a farm. Wind could carry it away. Dust could settle on it almost immediately. A clean garment on the trail enjoyed a fragile victory. Repairs were even more constant. Travel punished fabric. Clothing snagged. Shoes wore through. Wagon covers tore. Harness components needed attention. Bedding suffered. Women carried needles, thread, pins, buttons, patches, and whatever sewing supplies they could justify by weight. A tiny sewing kit could be more valuable than an ornament weighing 10 times as much. Because clothing failure on the trail was not cosmetic, a torn dress could worsen. A missing button could make a garment difficult to secure against cold. A damaged blanket reduced warmth. A worn shoe threatened the feet of someone who might have to walk beside the wagon for miles. Many emigrants did walk. Wagons were not comfortable passenger vehicles carrying families gently across the continent. Space inside was needed for supplies, and riding added load for the animals. Women therefore spent considerable time on foot, depending on circumstances. That meant the journey itself became labour. Walk, cook, gather fuel, fetch water, care for children, wash, repair, sleep, then repeat. And if something went wrong, the routine expanded. An ox could become lame. A wagon wheel could break. A storm could soak bedding. A child could develop a fever. Food could spoil. A river crossing could consume an entire day. Snow could close a pass. Cold rain could turn a camp into mud. Domestic labour had to continue inside every disruption. That may be the defining feature of women's work on the frontier. It was not performed after the adventure ended. It was what allowed the adventure to continue. Someone fed the people who crossed the plains. Someone kept their clothing functional. Someone tended the children who would reach the settlements. Someone gathered the fuel that heated the kettle. The Great Migration West is often drawn as a line across a map. For the women walking that line, it was measured differently. One breakfast, one bucket, one torn stocking, one cold camp, one more morning when the fire had to be started from nothing. For women who reached a permanent settlement, the work changed again. The wagons stopped. The household did not. In fact, establishing a new home could temporarily make domestic labour harder because a family often arrived before the systems that would eventually make daily life manageable had been built. A finished farmstead needed water access, fuel storage, shelter for animals, food storage, fencing, a garden, a functioning kitchen, places to keep tools, grain, clothing, and bedding. But a new claim might begin with almost none of those things. Families used what they could construct quickly. On the Great Plains, where timber could be scarce, some settlers built sod houses by cutting blocks of thick prairie turf and stacking them into walls. Others began in dugouts, using part of a hillside or excavated ground as shelter. These homes could offer real advantages. Thick earth moderated temperature better than thin wooden walls. A sod house might remain cooler in summer and retain heat surprisingly well in winter compared with a poorly built frame structure. But the same earth that insulated the family also created problems. Dirt entered everything. Walls could shed soil. Roofs could leak. Insects and small animals sometimes found their way inside. Periods of heavy rain could turn parts of the structure damp. A woman might sweep the floor and then watch more dirt fall from above. Housekeeping became less about achieving permanent cleanliness than controlling an environment that continuously regenerated mess. The ceiling itself could become an opponent. Accounts of sod house life describe rain carrying mud or debris downward from earthen roofs. Some families stretched cloth or another material beneath the ceiling to catch falling dirt. Imagine trying to prepare bread beneath a roof capable of sprinkling soil into the room. Food needed covering. Beds needed protection. Dishes needed wiping. And if a storm produced a leak, containers might have to be positioned around the room while normal chores continued between them. Yet winter could reveal the strength of the same structure. Earth walls were thick. Once heated, the interior could be more stable than a thin cabin exposed directly to prairie wind. That stability mattered because open plains offered almost nothing to slow a winter storm. Wind could strike a homestead for hours. Snow could drift against buildings and fences. Paths disappeared. Outbuildings became difficult to reach. The distance from house to barn might be only a few dozen yards, but in blowing snow those yards became a serious journey. Women still crossed them. Animals required water and feed. Fuel needed carrying. Chickens needed attention. A storm could not be allowed to erase the working connections between the different parts of the farm. This is why the location of buildings mattered so much. A well near the house saved steps every day. A woodpile, positioned intelligently, reduced exposure. A barn close enough to reach easily in bad weather offered practical advantages, although fire safety, drainage, smell, and available land influenced placement. The shape of the farm slowly became a map of repeated labour. Every path represented journeys someone made again and again. House to well, house to barn, house to privy, house to chicken coop, house to cellar, house to garden, house to woodpile. If one of those routes required 50 extra steps, 50 steps multiplied over hundreds of trips became significant. Women experienced that arithmetic physically. A poorly positioned water source became thousands of additional feet travelled while carrying weight. A badly arranged kitchen forced repeated movement between stove, table, pantry, and storage. Efficiency mattered long before anyone used modern language about workflow. Farm women reorganized spaces because their bodies immediately told them which arrangements wasted effort. The kitchen was particularly important. A practical kitchen concentrated frequently used objects near the places where they were needed. Pots near the stove. Water vessels accessible. Utensils within reach. Staples stored where they could remain dry and protected. A work table placed where there was enough light. Nothing about this required an architect. It required repetition. Perform the same task 1,000 times and inconvenient placement becomes impossible to ignore. The same practical intelligence shaped winter food storage. Root cellars and other cool storage spaces helped protect vegetables from freezing too hard while keeping them cool enough to slow spoilage. But stored food still required inspection. One rotten potato could encourage decay around it. Apples bruised during harvest could deteriorate. Rodents could reach supplies. Moisture could produce mold. Extreme cold could damage food if storage temperatures dropped too far. So winter provisions were not simply packed away and forgotten. They had to be watched. A woman might descend into the cellar and sort through produce, removing spoiled pieces before the damage spread. She was protecting the future, one potato at a time. Grain and flour created different challenges. Mice were constant competitors. Containers had to be closed. Sacks had to be protected. Food spilled around storage areas encouraged pests. Cats helped in some households, but no household could assume complete protection. Even insects could survive in stored grain products under the right conditions. Maintaining food, therefore, required vigilance long after harvest ended. Then there was meat. Cold weather could help preserve it, but temperature was not always steady enough to trust without other methods. Salting, smoking, drying, and later improved canning practices extended storage and reduced dependence on a single cold spell. But preserving meat often began with butchering. On many farms, late fall or winter was a practical time for slaughtering livestock, because cool temperatures reduced spoilage risk during processing. This created days of concentrated work. An animal represented far more than cuts of meat. Fat could be rendered, sausages could be prepared, meat could be salted or smoked, bones, organs, and scraps could be used according to household custom. Casings might need cleaning. Containers needed preparation. The work required knives, kettles, tables, salt, fuel, water, and coordinated labour. Women often played central roles in turning the slaughtered animal into food that could survive for months. The event was messy. Blood, fat, steam, water, and raw meat moved through the work area. Cleaning followed processing closely because contamination and spoilage were constant threats even before people understood bacteria in modern terms. Experience taught households that careless handling ruined food, and ruined food was expensive. A spoiled batch of meat represented more than a failed recipe. It represented feed consumed by the animal for months, time spent raising it, labour spent slaughtering it, salt used preserving it, fuel used processing it, and meals the family had expected to eat later. Preservation was therefore a form of risk management. Women learned which crocks needed checking, which meat needed more salt, which jars had failed, which apples should be eaten first, which potatoes would last, which foods could wait until March. A winter pantry was not simply a room full of supplies. It was a calendar. The most fragile items needed attention first. The strongest stores were held for later. Special ingredients might be reserved for holidays, guests, illness, or occasions when ordinary food needed improvement. This demanded judgment because no one knew exactly how severe the winter would become. A mild season could leave reserves in spring. A severe winter could consume fuel and food much faster than expected. Storms could delay travel. Prices could change. Animals could die. A family member could become sick. Unexpected guests might need feeding. Nothing guaranteed that the household's carefully calculated supply would match reality. So frontier housekeeping involved a constant negotiation between using enough and saving enough. Enough wood to remain warm. Enough flour to feed everyone. Enough soap to keep clothing usable. Enough lamp oil to finish necessary work. Enough feed to keep livestock alive, but never so much today that tomorrow became impossible. That quiet discipline rarely appears in heroic frontier paintings. There is no dramatic pose for checking potatoes, no monument to moving a flour sack away from mice, no grand historical scene built around deciding whether another log should go into the stove. Yet those decisions accumulated. A settlement survived because households repeatedly solved small problems before they became large ones. And women performed an enormous share of that preventive work. They noticed, they adjusted, they repaired, they preserved, they rationed, they kept the system moving. By the time a homestead looked established from the road, with smoke rising from a chimney and tracks packed into the snow between house and barn, much of its real infrastructure was invisible. It was not only the buildings, it was the routine connecting them. And every freezing morning, that routine had to be built again through footsteps. Not every frontier woman worked from an isolated farmstead. Some lived where the frontier had concentrated hundreds of people into one small place, and nowhere was that more obvious than around military posts. A 19th-century army fort could look orderly from a distance. Barracks, officers' quarters, storehouses, stables, workshops, flagstaff, parade ground. But behind that military arrangement existed a civilian world of wives, children, servants, laundresses, traders, labourers, and families trying to perform ordinary domestic work in places chosen primarily for strategic reasons rather than household convenience. For women, this created a different kind of freezing morning. The isolation remained. The water still froze. The clothing still became dirty. But now domestic labour could be tied directly to the needs of an institution. Army laundresses are one of the clearest examples. During much of the 19th century, the United States Army officially recognized laundresses attached to military companies. Regulations changed over time, but these women could receive rations, quarters, fuel, and access to medical care while earning money by washing soldiers' clothing. They occupied an unusual position. They were civilians, but they were formally connected to army life, and their work was essential enough to be regulated. At some posts, a laundress might wash for around 15 to 20 soldiers. That number changes the scale immediately. One man's dirty shirt is a chore. 15 men's shirts, drawers, socks, towels, bedding, and other washable items become a production system. Now place that system beside a frozen river. At Fort Laramie, for example, laundresses worked in a landscape where winters could be severe. Water might come from the Laramie River or from pumps and wells as facilities developed. Whatever the source, large amounts were required. There was no small load setting. Every gallon had to reach the washing area physically. If the water came from a river, the trip itself became part of the job. Ice along the bank could complicate access. Containers became heavy immediately. Wet hands became cold immediately. The water then needed heating. That required fuel. The army might provide an allowance of wood or access to fuel, depending on the period and post, but an allowance still had to become fire. Wood had to be carried. A fire had to be maintained. Large kettles or boilers had to absorb enough heat to warm or boil the water. Laundry, therefore, began long before a garment touched soap. A laundress was operating a small heat and water economy. Once washing began, volume created its own rhythm. Soak, soap, scrub, boil where appropriate, rinse, wring, repeat. Laundry from soldiers could be heavily soiled. Military life involved marching, horses, dust, mud, sweat, smoke, grease, and weeks of wearing garments under conditions that did not encourage delicacy. The laundress received the result. Wool presented special difficulties because aggressive washing or excessive heat could shrink or damage it. Cotton and linen behaved differently. Stains varied. Experience mattered. A competent laundress learned how much force a garment could tolerate and how much treatment dirt required. And then winter complicated drying. At a fort, a woman might have more laundry than could reasonably fit inside her quarters. Outdoor lines offered space but not reliable warmth. Garments could freeze. Wind could turn sheets into snapping sails. Snow could arrive before the load had dried. So the laundress watched weather almost like a farmer. A clear, dry day had value. Sunlight had value. Wind could help until it became too strong. A sudden storm could undo hours of planning. This work also reveals something often missed in simplified stories about 19th-century women. Domestic skill could have a cash price. Laundry was not merely something a wife performed for her household because custom expected it. At military posts, the same skill became paid labour. Soldiers owed money for having their clothing cleaned. That money could give a laundress a measure of economic independence, especially when combined with army rations and quarters. Some laundresses were soldiers' wives. Others were widows, or women whose household circumstances made paid washing important. Their income could support children, purchase household goods, or supplement a husband's military pay. Army wages for enlisted men were not generous. A laundress's earnings mattered. And because the work was physically difficult, a competent woman could develop a group of regular customers. The washboard became part of the frontier service economy. So did cooking. Women near forts, mining camps, railroad settlements, and growing towns could earn money by preparing meals, taking in boarders, sewing, baking, keeping lodging houses, teaching, nursing, or performing other services needed by populations in which men often greatly outnumbered women. The frontier created demand wherever ordinary infrastructure had not yet arrived. A mining camp could produce gold before it produced a reliable bakery. A railroad town could have saloons before it had comfortable housing. A military post could have cavalry horses before it had enough domestic workers. Women entered those gaps. The work could resemble traditional household labour, but payment transformed its economic position. Cooking for 6 family members was unpaid domestic work. Cooking for 6 boarders produced income. Washing a husband's shirts was expected household labour. Washing 15 soldiers' shirts was a commercial service. Sewing for children maintained the family. Sewing for customers could help finance it. The physical movements might be nearly identical. The economic meaning was not. Boarding houses are especially revealing because they multiplied domestic work the way military laundry did. Imagine feeding several additional adults through winter. More bread, more meat, more potatoes, more coffee, more dishes, more water, more fuel, more bedding, more laundry, more floors carrying mud inside. A boarding house keeper could spend nearly the entire day turning raw supplies into temporary comfort for paying guests. And comfort had value on the frontier precisely because so much of life was uncomfortable. A warm meal after working outdoors could feel extraordinary. A clean bed mattered. A repaired shirt mattered. Hot coffee mattered. A room protected from the wind mattered. Women could sell pieces of domestic normality to people living far from settled homes. Yet paid work rarely erased unpaid work. A laundress with children still had children after the soldiers' washing ended. A boarding house keeper still had her own clothing to mend. A woman selling butter still had to churn it. The income-producing task often rested on top of the ordinary domestic system rather than replacing it. That meant the frontier woman's workday could expand in 2 directions at once. First, maintain the household. Then, use household skills to generate cash. The stove served both purposes. So did the wash tub. This overlap becomes important when we ask what frontier women actually contributed economically. Official records often capture land purchases, military payrolls, livestock sales, business licenses, or male wages more clearly than hours spent cooking, carrying water, washing, repairing, preserving, nursing and supervising children. But those unpaid hours supported everything else. A soldier wearing clean clothing could return to duty. A farmer eating breakfast could return to the field. A railroad worker staying at a boarding house could return to construction. Children who were fed, clothed, and cared for became another generation of workers and settlers. Domestic labour sat beneath the visible economy like a foundation. You noticed it most clearly when it failed. No clean shirts, no meal, no dry bedding, no fire, no water, no one watching the children. Suddenly, the supposedly important work outside the household became difficult to perform. And this is why freezing mornings mattered beyond individual discomfort. Cold increased the cost of maintaining that foundation. More fuel had to be burned. More time went into water. Drying slowed. Animals required extra care. Clothing needed more protection. Every household process became slightly more demanding. Yet the soldiers still expected their laundry. Boarders still expected supper. Children still expected food. The people doing the maintenance therefore learned one of the oldest lessons of difficult work. Weather could change the method. It rarely changed the obligation. There was one frontier workplace that demanded almost everything at once. The winter sick room. A household could survive a cold morning by adding wood to the stove, carrying more water, wearing another layer, and moving quickly between chores. Illness disrupted that system from the inside. When someone became seriously sick, the amount of labour did not merely increase, the rhythm of the entire household changed. Meals might need to be prepared differently. Water was needed more often. Bedding became soiled. Clothing required changing. The patient needed warmth. Children still needed supervision. Animals still needed feeding. And the person providing most of that care was often the same woman already responsible for the ordinary work. Frontier communities did have physicians, midwives, neighbours, relatives, and experienced local caregivers, but access depended heavily on place. A doctor might live nearby in a settled town, or he might be many miles away. Snow could turn those miles into a serious obstacle. A horse had to be available. Roads had to be passable. Someone had to make the trip. Then the physician had to travel back. Until help arrived, the household managed with what it knew. Women therefore accumulated practical knowledge about nursing, partly because someone had to. They learned how to keep a patient comfortable, how to prepare simple foods, how to change bedding without chilling someone unnecessarily, how to clean wounds, how to recognize that an illness was becoming more serious, how to sit through a night when sleep was no longer an option. The medical remedies available to 19th century families ranged from useful to ineffective to actively dangerous. Patent medicines promised extraordinary results. Home remedies circulated through families and communities. Physicians themselves still used treatments that modern medicine abandoned. So it is important not to turn frontier women into magically knowledgeable doctors. They worked with the medical understanding available to them. But nursing itself mattered even when medicine failed. Clean water mattered. Warmth mattered. Food mattered. Observation mattered. Keeping a sick person from becoming dangerously cold mattered. And all of those required work. Imagine a child with a fever on a January night. The stove cannot simply be allowed to die. Someone checks the fire. The child sweats through clothing. Someone changes it. A drink is needed. Someone brings water. The bedding becomes damp. Someone changes or dries it. The child finally sleeps. Then the baby wakes. Morning arrives. The cow still needs milking. This is the part of frontier labour that rarely fits into a clean schedule. Emergency care rested on top of ordinary care. Pregnancy and childbirth created another version of that pressure. Frontier women gave birth in farmhouses, cabins, sod houses, military quarters, mining settlements, and occasionally while travelling overland. Childbirth was dangerous everywhere in the 19th century. Medical science had not yet eliminated many of the infections and complications that could kill mothers and babies. Distance increased the risk. An experienced midwife or physician might attend. Female relatives or neighbours often helped, but circumstances did not always allow ideal assistance. Winter could isolate a family precisely when help was needed. Preparations therefore took place inside the household. Clean cloth had to be available. Water needed heating. The room needed warming. Bedding required protection. Someone had to care for older children. Someone had to manage meals. Someone had to keep the ordinary household functioning while the mother could not. Community support could become essential. Neighbours exchanged labour partly because almost every household eventually faced a situation it could not manage alone. A woman might help another family during childbirth and later receive help when illness reached her own home. Food crossed property lines. Children temporarily stayed with neighbours. Someone milked another family's cow. Someone sat with a sick person. Someone helped prepare a body after death. Frontier independence therefore had limits. People depended on one another constantly. The myth of the completely self-sufficient family survives better in stories than it did in practice. A single household could produce impressive amounts of its own food, clothing repair, fuel, and labour. But no household controlled everything. Weather failed. Animals died. People were injured. Tools broke. Women became sick too. And when the central household worker became ill, the fragility of the system became obvious. Who cooked? Who remembered where supplies were stored? Who knew which child needed which garment repaired? Who managed the butter? Who checked the pantry? Who kept the washing moving? Who understood the sequence of ordinary tasks that had become almost invisible through repetition? Domestic skill was knowledge stored in a person. If that person was suddenly confined to bed, other family members might discover how much information they had relied upon without noticing. The same was true when women died. Maternal death could throw a household into crisis not only emotionally but practically. Children needed care immediately. Food still had to be produced. Clothing still had to be maintained. Widowers sometimes remarried relatively quickly, especially where young children were involved, and the practical demands of household survival were one reason. Women also experienced the reverse situation. A husband's death could leave a widow responsible for both the domestic system and work previously performed primarily by him. Now fences, livestock, debts, planting, harvesting, legal claims and household maintenance might converge on one person. Some widows sold property. Some relied heavily on relatives. Some remarried. Others continued farms and businesses themselves. There was no single frontier response, but the work did not wait for grief to finish. That might be one of the harder truths of 19th century domestic life. Loss created tasks. A death required washing and preparing the body according to family or community custom. Clothing might need arranging. Food was prepared for mourners. Children needed reassurance and supervision. Letters were written. Property had to be managed. Legal matters followed. In isolated communities, family members and neighbours performed many responsibilities later transferred to specialised professions. The home could become kitchen, laundry, nursery, workshop, sick room, birthing room, and place of death. Sometimes all within the same year. Those functions left physical traces. Extra bedding stored for illness or guests. Herbs, medicines, or patent remedies on a shelf. Pieces of clean cloth saved because they might be needed. Hot water containers. Basins. Scissors. Needles. Bandages improvised from old linen. Again, objects considered waste elsewhere could become valuable. A worn sheet that could no longer serve a bed might be cut into cleaning cloths or bandages. Soft fabric had another life waiting for it. This ability to preserve useful material became especially important when illness increased consumption suddenly. Cleaning demanded cloth. Nursing demanded cloth. Babies demanded cloth. Nothing disposable existed in the modern sense. After use, much of it returned to the laundry. So sickness fed directly back into the water system. More water carried, more water heated, more soap used, more fabric scrubbed, more material hung to dry. Then winter slowed the drying. Every disruption travelled through the household like a chain reaction. That is why a frontier woman's skill cannot be measured only by the individual chores she knew how to perform. The deeper skill was keeping the system functioning when several things went wrong simultaneously. A child had a fever. The temperature dropped. The woodpile was low. The cow needed attention. A pot was already on the stove. Someone had to decide what happened first. That decision was management. It required experience. Urgency did not make every task equally urgent. A good household manager learned which problems could wait. The floor could remain dirty. The shirt could remain unironed. The butter could perhaps be delayed. The sick child could not. Priorities shifted continuously. And then, once the crisis passed, the postponed labour remained exactly where it had been left. Laundry piled higher. Mending accumulated. Supplies ran lower. The house required cleaning. The frontier did not reward a woman for surviving an exhausting week by erasing the work she had missed. It simply returned the unfinished chores. So recovery rarely meant returning to nothing. It meant returning to a backlog. And on the next freezing morning, the stove still waited in the dark, holding either a bed of useful coals or cold ash. Either way, someone had to get up first. The next morning might look exactly like the one before it, but frontier work was never quite as repetitive as it first appears. The same stove was there, the same buckets, the same barn, the same wash basin, but the weather had changed. The wood supply had changed. The food stores had changed. Someone's boots had finally split. A child had grown. A cow had stopped giving as much milk. A hen had disappeared. The flour barrel was lower. A storm was coming. Daily work, repeated, but the conditions surrounding it were always moving. That meant women constantly improvised. Improvisation was not the dramatic invention of an entirely new tool. More often, it was the quiet ability to make an existing household function despite something being missing. No dry kindling? Use the driest material available and protect a small flame carefully. A garment could not dry outdoors? Move it nearer the stove without putting it close enough to scorch. Not enough fresh meat? Build the meal around beans, grain, preserved vegetables, or whatever remained. A mitten tore? Patch it before the hole became larger. A bucket handle failed? Transfer the water and find another container until the handle could be repaired. Frontier households operated with fewer layers of backup than modern households. Today, when a household tool breaks, replacement may be purchased almost immediately. A frontier family might have only one large wash kettle, one good axe, one coffee grinder, a limited number of blankets, a few usable buckets. If an essential object failed, the problem entered the day immediately. Women became familiar with the condition of their tools because those tools were extensions of labour. The washboard had to remain usable. The kettle could not leak badly. The stove door had to close. Needles were small enough to lose and useful enough to protect. Scissors needed care. Knives needed sharpening. A dull kitchen knife increased work every time it touched food. Even a broom gradually wore away. Maintaining equipment was therefore part of maintaining the household, and the most ordinary objects carried physical histories. A cast-iron skillet might serve for decades. A kettle could move with a family from one settlement to another. A quilt might contain pieces of garments worn by several people. A wooden spoon could become smooth from years of handling. These objects survived because replacing them required money, travel, or both. The same logic shaped food. Leftovers were rarely treated casually. Bread that had become hard could be soaked, toasted, crumbled, or incorporated into another dish. Bones could enrich broth. Meat scraps could become part of stew. Sour milk might still have culinary uses depending on its condition and household practice. Fat was saved. Drippings were saved. The goal was not to create endless novelty. It was to prevent nourishment from escaping. Frontier cooking therefore depended heavily on transformation. Yesterday's food became today's ingredient. A large pot could stretch expensive ingredients across many servings. Soups, stews, porridges, beans, breads, and similar foods made practical use of limited supplies. Winter made hot meals especially valuable, not because every meal was luxurious, but because warmth itself became part of eating. A bowl of hot food warmed hands and face. A mug of hot coffee, tea, milk, or another drink provided heat the body could feel immediately. The stove made the room warmer while producing the meal. Food and heating overlapped. That efficiency was useful because fuel disappeared quickly during severe cold. A household might burn far more wood during a bitter spell than during ordinary winter weather. The woodpile therefore became a visible measure of security. A large stack near the beginning of winter felt reassuring. By February, the same stack might look alarmingly reduced. A prolonged cold snap could force families to consume fuel faster than planned. Then someone had to obtain more. Even when men did most heavy cutting, the shortage affected everyone. Wet or green wood burned poorly and produced more smoke. Small pieces burned rapidly. Different species produced different amounts of heat. Experienced households knew their fuel. They knew which wood caught easily, which lasted, which sparked, which smoked, which should be saved for the coldest nights. Managing fire was therefore a form of budgeting. A roaring stove felt wonderful. It also consumed tomorrow's fuel. The house could not remain equally warm everywhere without paying that cost. Families adjusted. They gathered in fewer rooms. They closed doors. They wore more clothing indoors. Beds received extra layers. Unoccupied spaces were allowed to become cold. Some mornings, water left overnight inside the house could freeze if it was far enough from the stove. That detail says more about indoor life than any romantic picture of snow outside a cabin window. The cold was not merely beyond the wall. It entered. Windows accumulated frost because warm, moist indoor air met cold glass. The frost could become thick enough to obscure the view. Moisture condensed. Ice formed. Near the stove, a room could feel warm. Across the room, the temperature might be dramatically lower. Women worked across those different zones. Hands warmed while preparing food, then cooled while carrying something to another part of the house, then warmed again over wash water, then cooled outside at the well. The body repeatedly crossed a border between heat and cold. That constant change added fatigue even when nobody described it that way. Clothing had to manage both environments. Too little insulation made outdoor work miserable. Too much heavy clothing made indoor work uncomfortable near a hot stove. Women adjusted shawls, sleeves, aprons, hoods, and outer garments throughout the day. Wet clothing created the worst combination. Water transfers heat away from the body efficiently, making damp fabric dangerous in severe cold. A skirt hem wet with snow could become heavy and stiff. Mittens became less useful once soaked. Stockings needed drying. Boots required attention. This made avoiding unnecessary wetness part of practical winter survival. Paths around the homestead mattered for the same reason. Snow was shoveled, trampled, or cleared where possible between frequently used buildings. A clear route to the barn reduced effort. A clear path to the privy reduced risk. A clear path to the well mattered every day. Deep snow transformed carrying into something far more exhausting. Each step lifted the body higher. A full bucket swung. Balance became harder. So snow removal was not merely cosmetic. It protected the household's transportation network, and that network extended beyond the farm. Eventually, someone needed to travel. Mail had to be collected. Supplies had to be purchased. Grain might need milling. Produce might be sold. Church, school, court, or community business could require attendance. Winter travel depended on roads, snow depth, animals, vehicles, and distance. Sleds could make movement easier when snow conditions were right. Wagons could become nearly useless in deep snow or mud. Horses needed preparation. Travellers needed blankets and warm clothing. A trip that took an hour in good weather could become much longer. That encouraged another form of frontier planning. Do several errands at once. Bring eggs to sell. Buy salt. Pick up mail. Ask about a replacement part. Carry a letter for a neighbour. Collect something another household needed. Scarcity made cooperation efficient. One journey could serve several families. Women participated directly in these exchange networks. They loaned tools, shared food, borrowed ingredients, exchanged labour, passed along news, helped at births and illnesses, worked together during large food preservation tasks. Quilting bees and other communal work gatherings could combine labour with social life. This mattered because frontier women were not simply isolated figures standing alone against the weather. Some were isolated, sometimes painfully so. But communities formed systems of mutual dependence. A nearby woman might be the person who knew how to manage a difficult birth. Another might own equipment for a particular task. Someone had extra yeast starter. Someone else had thread. Someone had received a letter containing news from farther east. The frontier household survived not only through self-sufficiency, but through exchange. That is an important correction. Complete independence was expensive. Cooperation saved labour. And when winter narrowed the world to a few passable roads, a handful of neighbouring homes, and the smoke rising from distant chimneys, those relationships could become as useful as anything stored in the pantry. Because there were mornings when the thing a family lacked could not be manufactured from scraps, and then survival depended on knowing who might have one to spare. And when neighbours did have something to spare, the exchange was rarely as simple as handing it over. Frontier communities often operated through layers of obligation that were never written into a contract. Someone loaned a kettle. Someone helped butcher a hog. Someone watched children during an illness. Someone brought food after a birth. Someone lent a horse. Someone helped raise a wall or repair a roof. Later, when the need moved to another household, help was expected to move with it. Women were central to these networks because much of the exchange labour grew directly from domestic work. Food crossed between kitchens. Patterns and recipes travelled between households. Seeds were shared. Clothing was passed down. Babies' garments moved from families that no longer needed them to families that did. A woman who knew how to make a particular remedy, preserve a difficult food, cut a garment, or manage a birth, possessed knowledge that could become valuable far beyond her own walls. Information itself was a frontier resource. A new settler might know how to cook perfectly well, but have no experience with the local climate. When should potatoes be stored? How deep did frost usually reach? Which spring remained reliable in winter? Where could good firewood be found? Which road drifted shut first? Who owned a grain mill? Which merchant extended credit? A neighbour who had survived several winters already knew things no handbook could make equally useful. Women learned local survival partly through one another. That did not mean frontier communities were always harmonious. Neighbours quarrelled. Families competed over land and water. Religious, ethnic, political, and personal differences could divide settlements. Some women lived in profound loneliness despite technically having neighbours. Distances were sometimes too great for casual visiting, especially in winter. But social isolation itself helps explain why visits could carry so much weight. A person arriving at the door brought more than company. She brought news, perhaps a newspaper, perhaps a letter carried from town, perhaps information about prices, sickness, weather, a new family, a coming church gathering, or someone travelling east. The household's informational world expanded for a little while. Then the visitor left, and the horizon closed again. Winter narrowed that world further. Storms could prevent travel for days. Snow could bury roads. Extreme cold discouraged unnecessary journeys. A woman might spend long stretches seeing only members of her immediate household. There was work enough to fill the hours, but work did not remove loneliness. Letters therefore mattered enormously. For settlers separated from parents, siblings, or friends by hundreds of miles, correspondence preserved relationships across distance. Writing a letter required time, paper, ink or pencil, and some way to send it. The mail system itself could be irregular in remote districts. A letter might travel by rider, stagecoach, wagon, railroad, or a combination of routes before reaching its destination. News arrived old, but it arrived. Women wrote about births, deaths, crops, weather, health, prices, neighbours, journeys, and ordinary domestic details. Those details now give historians some of the most intimate evidence of frontier life. A diary entry about cold weather may record no dramatic event at all. That is precisely why it matters. Someone mentions frozen water, a difficult wash day, a sick child, a stove that smoked, a shortage of fuel, a bread failure, a trip delayed by snow. Individually, these seem minor. Together, they reconstruct the texture of daily survival. They also reveal how women measured time. The year was not simply divided into months. It was divided into work, planting, gardening, burying, haymaking, harvest, preserving, butchering, winter sowing, spring cleaning, lambing, carving, school terms, religious holidays, trips to town. The domestic calendar followed biology, weather, and food. Winter was therefore not an empty season. Field labour might decrease in some places, but indoor production increased. Clothing could be made and repaired. Quilts could be assembled. Wool could be processed. Tools could be maintained. Beans could be sorted. Corn could be shelled. Food stores could be checked. Children could receive more schooling at home when formal schooling was unavailable. And all the ordinary meals, washing, fire tending, and animal care continued underneath those seasonal jobs. The slower agricultural season did not necessarily create leisure. It redistributed labour. This was particularly true for textile work. Before industrial clothing became cheap and widely available, keeping a family clothed required an enormous amount of time somewhere in the economic system. Some households purchased cloth, others produced portions of it themselves. Many did both. Even when fabric came from a store, transforming it into a fitted garment took skill. Patterns might be purchased later in the century, but earlier sewing often relied on existing garments, measurements, experience, or locally exchanged knowledge. Fabric was expensive enough that poor cutting could waste valuable material. So women planned carefully. A dress had geometry hidden inside it. Sleeves needed matching. Seams required allowances. Pieces had to fit onto available cloth. Children grew, so garments needed room, alteration, or planned reuse. Then every seam had to be sewn. Hand sewing dominated before sewing machines became common. A simple line of stitching meant repeated penetration of needle through fabric, drawing thread after it, setting another stitch, and doing it again. Thousands of times. The spread of sewing machines during the 19th century changed this work dramatically for households that could obtain them. Early machines were expensive. Later models became increasingly accessible through mass production, installment purchasing, and aggressive marketing. A machine could perform certain kinds of stitching much faster than hand sewing, but it did not eliminate clothing work. Someone still measured, cut, fitted, busted, adjusted, finished edges, sewed buttons, mended tears, and learnt how to operate and maintain the machine. Technology reduced one bottleneck and revealed others. The same pattern appeared with cook stoves. An enclosed stove was easier and more fuel efficient in many respects than cooking entirely over an open hearth. But the stove did not chop wood. It did not carry water. It did not need bread. A washing machine, when mechanical washers began appearing in more households later, could reduce some scrubbing. It still required water and often human power. The frontier household gradually acquired labour-saving devices, but labour-saving did not mean labour-free. Women often used saved time to perform other necessary work. That matters because technological progress can create the illusion that each invention suddenly transformed daily life for everyone. It did not. Access spread unevenly. A prosperous town household might adopt a device years before an isolated farm. Transportation mattered. Cash mattered. Repair services mattered. A machine that broke in a remote area could become an expensive piece of furniture until someone obtained the necessary part. Old and new methods therefore existed beside one another for decades. One woman cooked on a modern manufactured range. Another still relied heavily on a fireplace. One owned a sewing machine. Another sewed entirely by hand. One household had a nearby pump. Another still carried water from a creek. There was never a single frontier morning. There were thousands of versions happening at once. What connected them was less the equipment than the responsibility. Whatever tools a woman possessed, she had to turn them into results. Warmth. Food, clean clothing, usable shelter, healthy animals, cared for children, enough supplies to reach tomorrow, and perhaps, somewhere between those tasks, enough time to write a letter telling someone far away what the winter was actually like. Not heroic, not picturesque, just cold, busy, and continuing. By the time a frontier family had survived several winters in the same place, something subtle had happened. The work had become knowledge. Not written knowledge necessarily. Not a manual sitting on a shelf. Knowledge stored in timing. In hands. In habits. In the ability to look at a stove and know whether the fire needed another piece of wood. In hearing a pump and recognizing that something was beginning to freeze. In lifting a sack and knowing how much flour remained without putting it on a scale. In pressing a thumb against dough and understanding that it needed more time. A woman who had lived through several severe winters did not face each cold morning as a completely new problem. She had patterns. She knew which corner of the kitchen stayed warmest, which door leaked wind, which window collected the most frost, which path drifted shut after a north wind, which child lost mittens, which cow kicked during milking, which pieces of wood should be saved for a night when the temperature dropped sharply. This accumulated knowledge made work faster, but it did not make the work light. Experience could eliminate wasted motion. It could not eliminate the bucket. That distinction matters. Frontier women were often highly efficient because inefficiency was expensive. If heating water required fuel, you did not heat it casually. If a trip to the cellar could retrieve 3 needed things, making 3 separate trips wasted time. Tasks were combined. A pot might warm while another chore was performed. Bread could rise while animals were being fed. Clothing could dry near the stove while vegetables were prepared. A child capable of carrying wood might be sent to refill the box before the fire became low. Work flowed around work. This kind of coordination rarely appears in inventories, because inventories record objects. 1 stove, 2 kettles, a washboard, 3 chairs, a bed, a spinning wheel. But an inventory cannot easily record the intelligence required to use those objects efficiently across the same hour. That intelligence was part of women's contribution to frontier survival, and it could be taught. Girls learned household labor gradually. A very young child might gather small objects, carry something light, hold yarn, watch a baby for a few minutes, or help feed chickens. As she grew, responsibilities increased. She learned to sew simple stitches, to sweep properly, to wash dishes without breaking them, to knead dough, to handle a hot stove carefully, to preserve food, to milk, to identify when butter had finally come, to understand which fabric tolerated boiling and which did not. By adulthood, a woman could possess years of practical training without ever having entered a formal classroom for domestic work. Boys also performed substantial household and farm labor, and divisions varied greatly between families. But girls were often prepared specifically for the possibility that they would someday manage households of their own. Marriage could move that knowledge into an entirely different environment. A woman raised in a wooded eastern region might settle on treeless prairie. A woman accustomed to relatives nearby might suddenly live miles from her nearest neighbor. Someone familiar with a fireplace might learn a new cook stove. Someone who had always drawn from a well might depend on a creek. The underlying skills remained useful. Observe, adapt, conserve, repair, plan ahead. The frontier punished rigid expectations. Winter punished them even faster. A household could plan to wash on Monday and discover that Monday brought a storm severe enough to make water hauling unreasonable. Then washing moved. Bread planned for supper could fail to rise quickly in a cold room. Then supper changed. A frozen pump required another water source. A sick animal interrupted sewing. A child with a fever interrupted everything. Schedules existed, but survival had priority. That flexibility explains why daily life could feel both repetitive and unpredictable. The same categories of work returned constantly. The exact sequence changed every day. There is also a danger in admiring this adaptability too much. Historical hardship can look impressive from a comfortable distance. A woman who carried water through snow may appear strong. She probably was, but strength did not make the bucket lighter. Endurance did not make frost pleasant. Skill did not turn wash day into recreation. People adapted because the alternative was allowing necessary work to remain undone. That is different from choosing hardship for its character-building value. Many frontier women welcomed technologies that reduced labor precisely because they understood the older labor so well. A better pump was useful. A reliable cook stove was useful. A sewing machine could be useful. A nearby railroad could transform access to manufactured goods. A commercial laundry eventually removed enormous work from households able to use one. Indoor plumbing was revolutionary. Running water changed more than drinking. It changed cooking, cleaning, bathing, laundry, fire safety, nursing, every task connected to the bucket. When water entered the house through pipes, thousands of future journeys disappeared. That is the scale on which domestic technology should be understood. Not merely minutes saved. Steps eliminated, Pounds no longer carried. Fires no longer required for every quantity of hot water. The same applies to washing machines. Early mechanical washers were not effortless appliances. Many still required manual operation, heated water, wringing, and considerable handling of clothing. But every mechanical movement that replaced scrubbing by hand reduced some part of the physical burden. Improvement arrived by degrees. A wringer saved twisting. A pump saved carrying. A stove improved control. A sewing machine accelerated seams. A commercial product replaced something that previously had to be manufactured at home. A railroad shortened supply chains. Each change removed a little friction from the day, and frontier women noticed friction better than almost anyone. They experienced technology at the level of fingers, backs, shoulders, and hours. A historian can describe modernization as expanding transportation networks or industrial production. A woman standing beside a washtub might describe it differently. Soap became easier to buy. Fabric became cheaper. A stove held heat better. The store carried canned goods. The railroad brought coal. Mail arrived more regularly. A machine stitched faster than her hands. Large historical transformations entered ordinary life through small practical changes. But those changes were uneven. A household near a prosperous town could gain access to new products relatively quickly. A remote farm might continue using older methods for years. Money could delay adoption even when goods were physically available. A sewing machine advertised as labor-saving still had to be purchased. So frontier life never moved neatly from primitive to modern. Old and new overlapped. A woman could use a manufactured stove while making soap from ashes. She could sew on a machine and still carry water from a well. She could purchase canned peaches while storing homegrown potatoes in a cellar. She could ride a train into town and return to a house without plumbing. Technological eras mixed inside one kitchen, and that kitchen remained the operational center of winter life. By afternoon, the stove might have been burning for hours. Its heat had cooked meals, warmed water, dried clothing, and taken the edge off the cold. Ash had accumulated beneath it. The wood box was lower. Steam had clouded windows. Boots had left marks near the door. Somewhere, a garment still needed mending. A kettle needed filling. Supper was approaching. The day had produced visible results. Food eaten, animals fed, clothes cleaned, water carried, rooms warmed, children cared for, but there was almost no finished product that could be stored as proof of the labor. Tomorrow's breakfast had not yet been cooked. Tomorrow's water had not yet been carried. Tomorrow's fire had not yet been built. Domestic work disappeared into use. A clean shirt became dirty. A full bucket became empty. A warm room became cold. A loaf became crumbs. A repaired mitten tore somewhere else. This was the strange economy of frontier women's work. Success continuously erased itself. The better the household functioned, the easier it was for an outsider to overlook what had produced that functioning. The meals simply appeared. The children were clothed. The fire was burning. The bedding was dry. The animals survived winter. The house remained inhabited. Nothing spectacular had happened. And that was the achievement. Because on the frontier, ordinary life was not the absence of struggle. Ordinary life was what all that struggle was trying to preserve. And eventually, every freezing morning reached the same quiet point. The light changed. The work did not exactly stop, but it changed shape. By late afternoon, shadows lengthened across the yard. The temperature could begin dropping again before the day's warmth had ever become comfortable. Water left outside became more vulnerable to freezing. Animals needed their evening attention. The stove needed enough fuel to carry the household through supper and toward the night. A woman who had been working since before breakfast now began preparing the household for darkness. Supper might already have been simmering. A stew that had cooked slowly for hours had one advantage beyond flavour. It used the same heat already warming the kitchen. Bread might be sliced from a loaf baked earlier. Potatoes could be boiled. Beans reheated. Salted meat added where available. Preserved vegetables opened. The meal varied from household to household, but the logic remained practical. Use what was available. Use what needed to be eaten. Use the fire already burning. Then everyone ate. For a little while, the work gathered around the table, and afterward came the dishes. There is something almost cruelly perfect about dishes as the final reminder of domestic labour. Cooking creates them. Eating creates more. And a family can finish a meal in minutes that required hours of preparation. The plates and utensils remain. Water was needed again. If warm water was preferred, heat was needed again. Food scraps had to be handled. Pots had to be cleaned well enough for tomorrow. A cast iron pan might be scraped, wiped, rinsed according to household practice, dried, and protected from rust. Wooden utensils needed cleaning. Knives needed wiping and putting away. The table needed clearing. The floor might need sweeping. Meanwhile, the stove continued consuming fuel. Someone checked the wood box. If it was nearly empty, another trip outside might be necessary before bed. This was a small task until the door opened. Then winter entered the room. Cold air rolled across the floor. A woman stepped outside with a basket or armload in mind, crossed the familiar path, selected enough wood, and returned carrying tomorrow morning's first advantage. Dry fuel indoors meant fewer steps in the dark. Kindling prepared before bed could save time. Matches, tinder, or fire-starting materials needed to remain accessible. If the family intended to preserve coals overnight, the fire had to be arranged carefully. Banking a fire meant reducing its intensity while protecting enough live embers to survive until morning. Done successfully, those coals could be uncovered, given air, and built back into flame. Done unsuccessfully, the stove would be cold. Either way, morning still came. Before sleep, animals might need one last check. A cow near calving, a horse that had seemed slightly lame, chickens secured against predators, water containers positioned as well as possible against freezing, barn doors closed, feed protected. The farm settled into darkness, one responsibility at a time. Inside, children were prepared for bed. Clothing came off in layers. Wet things moved toward warmth. Stockings were inspected. A mitten with a small hole might be placed somewhere obvious so it would not be forgotten. Shoes and boots were set where they could dry without being damaged by excessive heat. The clothing required for morning was easier to manage if it could be found quickly in the dark. This was another quiet efficiency learned through repetition. Do not make tomorrow harder than necessary. Lay out what will be needed. Refill what can be refilled. Cover what needs protecting. Soak what needs soaking. Set aside grain. Prepare breakfast ingredients. Move water indoors before the source becomes more difficult to reach. A surprising amount of morning work could begin the night before. Laundry might be left soaking. Beans might be placed in water. Bread starter might be prepared. A kettle filled. The stove arranged. The frontier day did not have a clean edge. Tomorrow leaked backward into tonight, and tonight carried the remains of today. The woman's hands might show it. Skin roughened by cold and water. Small cuts from work. Redness around knuckles. Dryness from soap. Needle marks. Minor burns. Calluses. These were not symbols anyone needed to admire. They were simply what repeated contact with physical work could leave behind. The same was true of fatigue. Not every frontier woman was permanently exhausted. People laughed, visited, read when they could, sang, played music, attended dances, went to church, celebrated holidays, told stories, courted, rested, made friendships, enjoyed their children, complained about their children, found humour in bad weather and terrible cooking accidents. Ordinary life contained pleasure because difficult circumstances did not erase human personality. That matters. It would be just as misleading to imagine frontier women as endlessly suffering as it would be to imagine their lives as cosy scenes of firelight and homemade bread. Both images are too simple. The firelight could be beautiful. Someone still had to carry the wood. The bread could smell wonderful. Someone had kneaded it. Fresh snow could make the farm silent and bright. Someone still had to walk through it to the barn. The history lives inside those two truths at once. There was beauty, there was labour, and the beauty often depended on the labour. As darkness settled, the household became smaller. Beyond the windows there might be no visible light for miles, or perhaps another chimney stood in the distance. Another farm with another kitchen, another family arranging itself against the cold. Inside, the lamp illuminated only a limited circle. Kerosene had to be conserved. A candle burned itself away, minute by minute. Work performed in that light was chosen carefully. Mending suited the evening. So did knitting, reading, letter writing, quiet preparation. Hands that had carried buckets in the morning could now hold a needle. A stocking turned slowly between fingers. Thread crossed a hole. The gap became smaller. A useful object returned to service. This was domestic work in miniature. Not creation from nothing. Restoration. Maintenance. The continual refusal to allow useful things to disappear before their time. Even that work had to end. The lamp was lowered. Children slept. The kitchen cooled. Heat retreated toward the stove. Rooms farther away became colder. Blankets replaced fire as the main defense against the night. And somewhere inside the stove, perhaps, a few red coals remained beneath grey ash. They looked almost dead, but if protected carefully, they could hold heat for hours. That small reserve of heat is a fitting place to leave the frontier morning, because almost everything these women did worked the same way. They carried something forward. Summer fruit into winter jars, autumn harvest into January meals, old clothing into new patches, milk into butter, ash into soap, scraps into quilts, experience into daughters, neighbourly help into future obligation, even today's fire into tomorrow's flame. The work was repetitive because life itself was repetitive. People became hungry again. Clothing became dirty again. Rooms became cold again. Children grew. Wood piles shrank. Buckets emptied. And every time the household consumed what had been prepared for it, someone began preparing again. So when we imagine a frontier woman rising on a freezing morning, it is easy to focus on the cold, the frost, the frozen pump, the heavy bucket, the smoke from the chimney. But the most remarkable part was not that she endured one brutal morning. It was that there had been another morning before it, and another before that. Hundreds of fires started, thousands of meals prepared, countless buckets lifted, shirts scrubbed, buttons sewn, eggs gathered, children washed, animals fed, floors swept, loaves baked. The individual acts were small. Together they built a household. Together those households built settlements. And long after the wash water was thrown out, the stove cooled, and the paths between those old houses and barns disappeared beneath new roads and fields, the work remains hidden inside the history. Quiet. Necessary, repeated until one winter morning became another, and another, and then, eventually, spring.